Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, still working on the mic here. We'll let that get started because we got stuff online that we need to make sure of. Okay, we're good. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and really glad to have you here today. If you are joining us for the first time, either live or at home, we are one of the nation's premier education policy think tanks. We also do work on the ground in the great state of Ohio, where we are an education reform advocacy organization in Columbus, and also charter, right now, 11 charter schools out of our Dayton office. We are gathered here today to talk about the future of teacher unions. But that's a little bit of a misnomer, because what we're really going to talk about today, at least spend a lot of our time focusing on, is how the education reform community should address the power of the teachers' unions going forward. And on that score, there are some very sharp differences of opinion within the reform crowd. On the one hand, there are conservative reformers, mostly Republicans, who applauded the efforts of Wisconsin's Scott Walker and Ohio's John Kasich to, to limit the scope of collective bargaining, to outlaw teacher strikes, and to eliminate agency fees. And these are the fees paid to the unions by non-members. In this perspective, unions are all powerful behemoths that need to be reined in, and particularly at the local level, where they can easily elect school board members friendly to their positions, they can be in the position of bargaining with themselves. Right? So goes the argument. With this line of thinking, states need to act to contain their power, lest they block reform and drive up costs, and otherwise do what interest groups tend to do. On the other side are the progressive reformers, mostly Democrats, who bemoaned the aggressive tactics of Walker and Kasich and argued for a more conciliatory approach. So Education Secretary Arne Duncan, for example, back during the big debates in Wisconsin, he argued that Walker's position was, quote, nonsensical, because the unions had already conceded on key kitchen table issues. They'd already said, we will take lower pay, lower benefits. To be sure, these progressives aren't afraid to skirmish with the unions or to raise money to defeat them politically, Joe. But they see collective bargaining and striking rights as sacrosanct. And this issue is far from settled. California, in a few weeks, it has an initiative on the ballot that would make the Golden State a right-to-work state, meaning that it would eliminate these agency fees paid by non-members. Michigan has an amendment on the ballot that would enshrine collective bargaining rights in the state constitution. So these debates are alive and well. And so what we're going to try to get at today is to figure out which part of the reform coalition is right on this issue. Should reformers work at the state level to curtail collective bargaining rights, to make teacher strikes illegal, to turn every state into a right-to-work state where these agency fees are not allowed? So to debate these issues, we have two leading opinion makers in the reform community. Very excited to have them with us. And we are doing this town hall style, by the way, just like last night with the presidential debate. Now, hopefully, I don't want to see you guys standing up and coming to blows, okay? I think many of us thought that perhaps the president and the governor were going to start punching each other. I don't want to see that kind of behavior here, guys. All right, so first up, we have Joe Williams, who is the executive director of Democrats for Education Reform, formerly a journalist at the New York Daily News and Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and he's written a ton on education and wrote a great book several years ago, Cheating Our Kids, How Politics and Greed Ruin Education. It's a good title.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, very good. And then we have Terry Moe. Terry Moe is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and also a political scientist at Stanford University. He's kind of written the eminent book on unions called Special Interest Teacher Unions in America's Public Schools. Of course, Terry has a very distinguished career, including writing another seminal book, which is where is it? Politics, Markets, and America's Schools, of course. Probably one of the first books I ever read on education reform. And you don't want to know how old I was back then.
I'm not asking.
All right, there you go. Good. He also, we should point out, received the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation Prize for Excellence in Education, which we were very glad to give you a few years ago. Okay, so to get started, those of you who are watching online, we want you to join the conversation. When it comes time for questions, you can send us questions at edexcellence.net. On Twitter, both online and those of you I see tweeting live. I know you're not checking your email on your iPhones. You are tweeting, right? Good. You want to use the hashtag #AfterChi. This is not like Tai Chi. This is like Chicago. Okay, so after and then the word CHI. That's our hashtag, and we will start the conversation. So this is going to be a debate. So we are going to start by giving each of our speakers 10 minutes to make their case. And so we will start with Joe to make the case on behalf of progressives about why we shouldn't go after some of these fundamental collective bargaining, agency fees, striking rights, and the like. Joe, take it away.
Sure, and I think for the first portion of the the 10 minutes that Mike is giving me to make my case, I want to try to offer a little bit of context for where I think this discussion is likely to go after we do our 10 minutes. And it's a sort of not even half-baked, maybe a quarter-baked theory that I'm still playing out. Maybe I'll discard it after this if you convince me it's not worthwhile. But it's something that I'm sort of playing with and sort of looking back at the last 10, 15, 20 years of education reforms, being a series of overreaches and then recalibration. And I can look back and I think make a pretty good case over beer sometime about who was doing the overreaching and what the recalibration looked like. But I'm going to sort of come back to this overreach theory and recalibration, and think back 2 years ago around the country about what was happening politically with education reform. And I think I'm going to try to make a political argument today, and not merely one about what is collectively bargained or what kind of role teacher unions are playing or not playing in change that's happening on the ground or not happening on the ground in districts around the country. But one that looks at where the possession arrow was pointed, like a college basketball sort of situation. We were in what I would consider a dramatic period of recalibration 2 years ago. We were looking at, and it was recalibration driven by three primary concerns or driving factors. One was fiscal reality, that it was abundantly clear to many political leaders and bean counters in government that doing things the way we had been doing things within public education, it wasn't going to work in a fiscal sense. We had a lot of long-term obligations which were coming due, which we were falling behind on. And essentially that the sustainability of public education, if we were not to make any changes, was going to be very difficult. The federal stimulus package, which included a significant amount of money that went to districts to keep teachers employed back in 2009 and 2010, sort of prolonged some of the pain and some of the edges of these discussions, but it didn't erase them completely. We were dealing with an outputs-based reality. That we had more data than we've ever had before about what was working and what wasn't working in schools. And there were a lot of politicians around the country who, most notably Democrats, who were frustrated that they were offering solutions, often partnering with teacher unions, that didn't seem to match the severity of the problems that were becoming apparent to just about everyone in sort of the post No Child Left Behind world. Sure, I'll get back to that point. The third issue that was driving this was a sort of lack of broad-based solidarity on the part of organized labor in general, not just teacher unions. Frustrations that teacher unions were not there to fight side by side with other labor unions around the country. Frustrations from other public sector unions in particular, that while they had been making concessions in the last 10 years, teacher unions generally were asking for more and more at the table. And there was, you can debate about the size of the split, but there was a lot of anxiety within the labor movement in general about where teacher unions were positioned. So with some prodding from Race at the Top and some other factors, we started to see a lot of different conversations that were playing out in state houses and governor mansions around the country, both in states that were controlled by Democrats and states that were controlled by Republicans. And it was generally about what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about the fiscal realities that we're confronted with? What are we going to do about the educational realities that we're confronted with? And at times, the two would dovetail together. If you started to imagine what a bailout was going to look like eventually for underfunded pension systems or even just general operating budgets for school systems around the country, there were a lot of politicians who were saying, we're not going to be able to go to taxpayers and ask them to dig down even deeper to solve some very big problems that were looming on the horizon unless we were able to make a very clear and convincing case to them that we were doing something different in public education. In many of the states, particularly states where there were Democratic leaders in senates and assemblies and Democratic governors, teacher unions were involved in these conversations, and they were stepping up to the plate, I would argue, with some more than just what Mike mentioned about in Wisconsin, where they were offering wage concessions and benefit concessions, offering to go down some paths that they had not been willing to go down in the past. Issues like teacher evaluations that had some component tied to student performance. Issues like greater public school choice. Even some issues which had been sort of the holy grail at time about tenure and what it means to earn tenure in places. So this was sort of the backdrop that was playing out in many states around the country 2 years ago, at a time when the Wisconsin legislature went overwhelmingly to the Republicans in elections, and Governor Scott Walker was elected. At the time when Governor Walker took office and the Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate in Wisconsin, it was common knowledge, and everybody understood that elections mattered. And what you saw from the Wisconsin Education Association Council were what appeared to be, at least on the outside, to be initial overtures to start going down some of these paths about dealing with teacher evaluations, dealing with performance pay, and in a few weeks prior to the legislation that was introduced by Governor Walker, you saw the state union in Wisconsin essentially throw the largest city in the state under the bus. They supported discussions about breaking up the Milwaukee Public School District into smaller pieces, which had been something that had been on the table for the last 25, 30 years in Wisconsin and was generally opposed by teacher unions there at the time. Aside from what the union was offering, politically what was playing out in Wisconsin at the time, you saw a larger number than ever before collection of Democratic state legislators, particularly in the Milwaukee area, who were actively engaged in school reform discussions which had been off the table for Democrats for a long time. This included an expansion of Milwaukee's private school choice program. Excuse me one sec. Dry mouth here. Excuse me.
Water too. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Water all around.
Growing Democratic support for expanding charter schools in Wisconsin and making efforts to attract some of the nation's high-performing charter school networks into the state, and some of the other teacher tenure and some of those issues. To be fair, in the aftermath of all of the drama that played out in Wisconsin, some of these issues did go through. There was an expansion of the voucher program, particularly because Governor Walker was pushing it so hard, with some Democratic support. There's a very slow-moving teacher evaluation plan in Wisconsin that's attached to the state's waiver application from the federal government from No Child Left Behind. But what we saw when Governor Walker introduced his package of legislation that the way it looked to me was just nothing but an attack on a political opponent in the form of teacher unions, was a dramatic retreat on a lot of these issues. It began a war that's got casualties that we're still beginning to see. And it began a massive recalibration of sort of the education reform dialogue and discussion. Where before the discussion was about what are we going to do to save public education, Governor Walker shifted the discussion to what are we going to do to save labor unions. And it becomes a very different sounding existential discussion that plays out. The overreach, which I would argue in this case, Governor Walker's overreach, very much shifted the momentum, and we're still seeing that today. The strike in Chicago, I would argue, had very little to do with actually what was being bargained collectively. The strike vote took place even before the union got its fact finders report. And if you sort of listen to the comments and the frustration of teachers who were picketing in Chicago, it wasn't just about this contract. It was sort of about the education reform movement in general. Again, part of sort of the recalibration of an overreach. So I'm not sure whether the Chicago strike is going to be the end of Act One. We're going to start looking to an Act Two where the biggest question is going to be, did the Chicago Teachers Union overreach in that case, or did Mayor Emanuel overreach? I think it still remains to be seen, but I think anybody who was watching closely saw that in addition to the larger issues of education reform and standing up to a perceived threat in the form of Mayor Rahm Emanuel, a very important issue that was hanging over the negotiations and the strike there had to do with what are they going to do about closing schools in Chicago, and what kind of role will non-unionized charter schools play if schools are closed and replaced. I think this is just the beginning. I mean, to talk about winners and losers in the Chicago strike, it's sort of like deciding in the third inning of a baseball game who won and lost. I think there's a lot to go. I can't predict what's going to happen in Act Two. I think the pressing fiscal reality in Chicago right now is daunting. The educational issues that are in play are dramatic. There's less consensus than ever before about how to deal with it. In some way, under the stories about the pension situation in Chicago seem like a fiscal time bomb waiting to happen. Stories from the last weeks or so pointing out that the school system was built for 600,000 seats, and there's 400,000 students. A contract that nobody seems to be sure how they're going to be able to afford. Pension fund with $10 billion in assets paying out more than $1 billion per year. And a district that last year pretty much drained all of its reserves. The issues that are going to be playing out between labor and management in Chicago, I think, are going to be bellwether for where the next few years of education reform go.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. So basically there were the action in Wisconsin and other places. There's been blowback. There's been some casualties in terms of reform momentum, and you've seen some reform-minded Democrats step back and circle the
Absolutely.
wagons because of that. Okay.
And just on following up on that note, there was a lot of the phrase, "We don't want this to be another Wisconsin," came up constantly in state legislatures around the country last year as we were doing this kind of stuff.
Okay. Terry, your turn.
All right. So I'm going to set this issue up in a somewhat different way. So let me start out with a few basic questions about America's public schools. Why is it that for the past 30 years we haven't been able to get underperforming teachers out of the classroom, even if they're totally incompetent? Why is it that for 30 years teacher evaluations have just been a charade? And 99% of all teachers get satisfactory evaluations. Now, why is it that teacher pay has nothing to do with how much their students learn? And salary is not used at all as an incentive to motivate productive behavior as it is elsewhere in the labor market. Why is it that in many districts seniority prevails when layoffs have to occur, and so young, fantastic teachers are automatically fired, and some senior teachers, who everybody knows are terrible in the classroom, are kept on? So why is this so? Well, there is no rational explanation for this in terms of effective organization. Right? The fact is, no one in their right mind would organize the schools in this way if all they were thinking about is what's best for children. The organization of America's schools is perverse. Okay? Why is it this way? Why is it this way? And there are many factors that could be brought into play, but the main explanation is that the teachers' unions are extraordinarily powerful. And they like it this way. They like the schools to be organized this way. They fight for it, and they get it. Now, why do they do that? They do it because, not because they're bad people, right? I think unions care about schools, they care about kids. They do it because their fundamental interest is in jobs. The unions are unions, and they're about protecting the jobs of their members and about promoting the occupational interests of their members. They are special interest groups. That doesn't make them bad. That just is what they are, and that's how we need to understand their behavior. Okay, so how do they pursue these job interests? How do they exercise their power? Well, they do it through collective bargaining, and they do it through politics. So in collective bargaining, they shape the schools from the bottom up. And everybody talks about wages and benefits, but they have a profound influence on the organization of schools. And they load contracts up with countless rules, about seniority, about evaluation, about teacher assignments, about almost everything you can imagine. And none of these things are adopted because they're going to make the schools effective. They're adopted for reasons having to do with job protection. Right? And the Chicago strike was fundamentally about the organization of schools. Right? The way the schools are organized is perverse, and Rahm Emanuel came along and said, look, we want to have performance-based evaluations, we want to have performance-based pay, we want to substitute performance for seniority in layoffs. And the union said, no, we're opposed to that. And they are opposed to that, because these things are threatening to jobs for a variety of reasons. Right? And this kind of thing plays itself out all across the country all the time. And it doesn't have to result in strikes, it's just happening, right? Because the unions exercise their power to protect jobs. Okay, in politics, it's very different, right? What the unions do in politics is they use their political power in the political process with legislatures, usually at the state level, because this is where reform politics plays itself out and has been for the last 30 years. Now, the American political system is famously built around checks and balances. And what that means is there are a lot of veto points. And because there are a lot of veto points, it's much easier to block than it is to actually get something through. And so any groups that just want to block have a huge advantage. Well, that's what they want to do. The reform era is about passing legislation that will really transform the education system. They don't want that. It's threatening to jobs. And so they have used their power over the last 30 years to block or weaken, to the extent they can, accountability, pay for performance, performance-based evaluations, and all sorts of other reforms related to accountability, and school choice. Right? These things are all threatening the jobs from their standpoint. Think about school choice. Families are begging for new alternatives out there. Right? And competition would be good for the regular public schools. But when you allow choice, what you're doing is allowing kids to leave the regular public schools for, say, charter schools. Well, when they leave, money goes and jobs go. And that is the last thing they want. So what the unions want is for no child to leave a regular public school, and they are opposed to choice. And as a result, here we are, 2012, 4.5% of the kids are in charter schools. The unions have been very successful at limiting choice. We have accountability systems, 50+1 accountability systems all across the country. There are very few real consequences built into these systems. Schools and teachers really are not held accountable for teaching kids what they're supposed to know. That's because these systems are weak, and they've been rendered politically weak over the last 20 years. All right, so this is a built-in problem. And the problem is that the unions are really powerful, and they use their power to protect jobs and promote job interests, and those interests just aren't the same as the interests of kids. They're not. So this is not a problem of, oh, union leaders are bad people, or teachers don't care about kids. That's not it. It's actually worse than that, right? Because this is a structural problem. The unions have interests that drive their behavior, just like business firms. Business firms want to make money. That's how you explain their behavior. And you can talk to them from now until doomsday, right? About, why don't you guys just behave in the public interest, right? They won't do that. They'll say they are, but actually they want to make money. And that's what determines their behavior. With the unions, they want to protect jobs. They're unions. And that doesn't make them bad, doesn't make them good. But in the context of education, it means that they will do things, and they have done things that are not good for effective organization and therefore not good for kids. And that's just the way it is. Okay, so this is a problem of union power, and the only solution to it is to weaken union power. So the question is that possible? And how can we do that? Okay, well, there's a direct approach, which is strip away collective bargaining rights. Collective bargaining is the foundation of union power. Okay, so what's the problem with that? Well, the unions are powerful, right? So you try to take away their power, and they will use their power to stop you. And that's what's been happening, right? I mean, you don't even have to try to do it. I mean, any smart politician knows there's hell to be paid if you take on the unions. They're powerful. So most politicians won't do it. But recently, there's been a perfect storm, right? Because of the financial crisis, because of the pension crisis, and because the Republicans, backed by the Tea Party, won a huge victory in 2010, took over a number of states like Wisconsin, and all of a sudden there were people willing to do it. And that's why this thing happened in Wisconsin. But this is not a general solution, right? Especially with all the havoc that it wrought in Wisconsin. I think all the other governors are looking and saying, I'm never going to do that. That was horrifying from a political standpoint, right? And that was that lesson that they're drawing. So even if others did want to do it, this is not a general thing. It's not going to sweep the nation, right? So I actually think that it would be good for effective organization, good for the performance of the public schools if there were no collective bargaining, or maybe collective bargaining over wages, but no work rules. Because the unions will use their power to impose work rules that actually undermine effective organization, and that has to be stopped. The problem is, how do you stop it? Because Governor Walker's solution is not a general solution. Okay, so there's a second approach, and that is the democratic approach, and this is this new thing that's happened, symbolized by Democrats for Education Reform, whose efforts I totally applaud, and I really admire Joe for the work that he's done over the last several years. So, look, what's been happening is that there's been a ferment within the Democratic Party. See, it used to be that there was this strict alliance between the unions and the Democrats, and the Democrats just carried the water for the unions and really couldn't be aggressive advocates for disadvantaged kids who are their constituents. And groups like the Democrats for Education Reform was the main group, stood up and said, we're not going to take this anymore. We are going to represent those kids, and we're going to challenge the unions. Going to take them on. And President Obama and Arne Duncan did it with Race to the Top, right? They pushed reform in a direction that unions didn't want to go, and they're Democrats. They did this. This is an amazing thing, really. Politically, they deserve a medal for doing what they did. Okay.
That was a great line to tweet, everybody. Okay,
so, there's a problem here. And the problem is that they're Democrats. And because they're Democrats, most of these people believe in collective bargaining, they believe in unions, they believe unions and collective bargaining are good. And so they don't want to say, we have to undermine collective bargaining in order to make the schools work well. They don't want to give up on collective bargaining. And then the other thing is that union power, literally, powerful unions, are the power base of the Democratic Party. And if you undermine the power of the unions, you're undermining the power of the Democratic Party. Well, Democrats don't want to do that. Okay, so here's the dilemma. If you believe, and I think it's incontrovertible, that union power translates into ineffective organization for the schools and the inability to do anything about it, then what? if you're not willing to challenge union power, do anything about that, and you think, we have to accept union power, then what is the solution? Well, I think the solution has been that democratic reformers convince themselves that you can have powerful unions and effective organization in the schools. And the way you can do that is by getting the unions to be nice, by getting the unions to change their behavior so they can stay powerful, we can have collective bargaining, and if the unions will just behave differently, everything will be great. Well, this is not going to happen. The unions' interests are the same. They're job interests. Again, this is not personal. It doesn't matter who the leaders of the unions are. Unions are unions, and they protect jobs. They always will. Now, in the current climate, which is terrible for them, the unions are up against the wall, and they're making concessions. And so I think what democratic reformers will do is they'll point to the concessions, and they'll say, see, the unions are changing their behavior. But those are just strategic adjustments to a really bad environment. They're doing as little as they have to, and if they can, down the road, they'll reverse those things. Also, they want to look like reformers, right, and say they're reformers. Randy Weingarten is an artist at this, right? But really what they're doing is they're just calling their concessions reforms, and in the collaboration process over time, they will do the same thing they always do. They'll pursue their interests. This is just another forum for pursuing their interests, and they will use whatever power they have to weaken those reforms on the ground. And so the bottom line is, yeah, I think this is great. We're going to make some progress. This is a good thing. And we are making progress. And I think we can move from the 30-yard line to the 40-yard line. That's something. However, we will never get across the goal line this way. As long as the unions are powerful, we're not going to get there. So I think this is the fundamental dilemma for Democrats. And in my view, if they don't face up to it and do something about the power problem, they'll never take us across the goal line, and they have to decide if they're okay with that.
Okay, so Terry, let me make sure I understand those. So, because one reading of what you just said is that it's hopeless, right? I don't think you mean to say that. So should reformers challenge the unions politically then? Try to take away collective bargaining rights, some of these other rights?
Okay.
Are you saying that is a good thing to do, or is that not a good thing?
Okay, I think it's a good thing to do because I think that union power is bad for schools. So I think if you can take action in Wisconsin or anywhere else that undermines union power, I think that's good. It's good for schools. Now, it's bad for the Democratic Party, right? Okay, I understand why people would care about that. But you need to know that if you say, okay, I'm not going to do anything about union power because I'm a Democrat, then you're hurting the schools. Okay, so that is not a winning strategy across the whole nation, right? And you can't rely on the Democrats across the whole nation. So in that sense, it's hopeless. However, there is one solution. And the one solution, which I talk about in my book and also talked about in the book Liberating Learning with John Chubb, is technology. And so I think long term, and we can talk about this technology revolution is coming. We're just in the early stages of it, but it is going to transform the whole school system. There's going to be a massive substitution of technology for labor. Teachers aren't going to be concentrated in the district anymore. There's going to be a lot of contracting out to different kinds of online providers. And the net result of all these things is going to be that unions are just not going to have nearly as many members. They're not going to have nearly as much money. And they're going to get weaker and weaker over time, and they won't be able to block things. And this is going to take decades. Right? It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it is going to happen, and that, I think, is the solution.
Okay, so Joe, back to you here. So it sounds like Terry is acknowledging that there was progress being made. You saw unions making concessions, but that was only strategic. It was temporary. That without keeping up the pressure on them, that was going to go away. So what do you say to that? Do you agree, or did you think that these were more long-term, transformational kinds of changes?
I think they were. I think that that the changes were being made with an eye toward the long-term viability of public education. I think it was a discussion that was less threatening than the existence or the right of unions to exist in and of themselves. It was about what are we going to do to get through this fiscal problem that we have and deal with the education problems that are sitting right in front of us. I just want to go back to one thing, the way that this has been framed, that it's a choice between either challenging teacher unions and ending collective bargaining, or basically just singing Kumbaya and hoping for the best. Rick Hess used the word cuddly at one point a year ago. He accused me of saying I was pushing a cuddly approach. And while I like cuddling just as much as the next warm-blooded American male, I think there's a way that you can challenge unions and respect the collective bargaining process. I think most union leaders I've ever talked to about collective bargaining as a 30,000-foot issue would tell you it works best when there's a spirited debate on both sides. I live in New York, where people like to yell and scream at each other all the time and then watch the Yankees together afterwards. And I think that there is an approach, and it's something that we've tried to encourage on the Democratic side, for elected mayors to be held accountable for what gets collectively bargained. All the stuff that Terry complains about that are in collective bargaining agreements, they didn't get there by an act of God. They were agreed to by labor and management, and they can be changed, particularly in times when there's a very compelling reason that both sides acknowledge is a reason to make those changes. And I think we were closer than we had been in a long time to getting an understanding that we were close to the breaking point where something had to budge. And now the discussion has moved to something totally different than where we were at 2 years ago.
But doesn't Chicago, and I'm sorry folks, I'm having a hard time, there we go, okay. Doesn't Chicago though raise questions about your argument that you had a mayor, you even had a state law that tried to limit collective bargaining somewhat. You had a law that said you can strike teachers, but again limited what you could strike over. You had, in many ways, again, a perfect storm. And yet I think most of us think that in the end, Rahm got rolled, and that there are still lots of work rules in Chicago that are not good for kids. So doesn't that mean that something's wrong with your theory?
Well, I will concede that Chicago was weird, and it was, I would argue that Karen Lewis from the Chicago Teachers Union acted much more like Scott Walker in showing an outward disdain for collective bargaining than Mayor Emanuel did. That was a strike that didn't need to happen. That was something, if you look at the way it ended up, rational human beings with a respect for the collective bargaining process should have been able to work through that without having to keep kids out of school for that week. Look, it's difficult. I think that for a mayor to go in and do this, they can't just go in for the fight. They've got to be able to make a broader case to the public about why this fight is necessary. And I don't think in hindsight that happened in Chicago. I think a lot of people outside of Chicago believed that Rahm was winning for a while, so they feel disappointed when it was at the end. But within the city of Chicago, there was tremendous support for the striking teachers, particularly from parents. Where that's obviously the group that's up for grabs in any kind of teacher strike. If the parents turn on the teachers, it's over. In this case, they held with the teachers till the end.
Whenever there's collective bargaining, you have compromise, and if you have compromise, what that means is that job interests are going to play a very big role in how the schools actually get organized. Just read through and look at some of the work rules. What in God's name are they doing in there? They're not in there to promote effective organization, right? And look what they were doing in New York City the whole time that Joel Klein was there. He was struggling with this labor contract that was filled with these restrictive rules, trying to do something about it. And he was able to relax a few of them. And in return, Randy Weingarten got a ton of money, right? That's why she was willing to give up on those things. But now they just have a contract that's only this thick, instead of this thick, right? It's still burdensome to the district, and it doesn't look anything like what you would want if you just wanted the district to be organized for the benefit of children. And that's the problem.
Terry, let's talk about strikes. I believe it's a majority of states that have made teacher strikes illegal. The other states could do that as well. Is that something that helps? I mean, would this have played out very differently in Chicago if teachers would have been arrested for striking?
Well, strikes are an important part of the union arsenal, but basically strikes are rare. And I don't think that's an important part of the equation here. I think really what's important is collective bargaining, whether they can strike or not, is the foundation of union power. It's what gives them huge advantages in attracting members and attracting money that comes in regularly every month which they then use to become politically powerful, right? So collective bargaining is really the key to their power. Also, it gives them a means to shape the organization of schooling directly. And once they've shaped it, right, once you have these contracts that are filled with rules, then they have blocking power, right? Then the administration has to come and say, can we please change some of these rules? And the union can say, no. You know, they're in the contract, and they can just block, right? So this is a very, very bad situation from the standpoint of organizational design. I think probably most people who think about the schools think, well, the purpose of the schools is to educate kids, so naturally we're trying to organize the schools in the most effective ways to do that. And the fact is, no, we're not. That is not how schools get organized. They're organized by power.
All right, now another source of union power, you could argue, are agency fees. Okay, this is, when people talk about right-to-work states, that's not states where teachers are allowed to bargain collectively. That's a different issue. The right-to-work states are the ones where the unions are allowed to accept agency fees, which are fees from teachers who are not members of the union, but have to pay these fees anyways. And that allows them to collect a lot of money, some of which can go into politics and the like in certain states. So to you, Joe, there is a ballot initiative, as I mentioned before, in California that would basically push for paycheck protection. So in other words, no more agency fees going to the unions automatically to non-members. Your president of DFER California, Gloria Romero, has come out saying she supports that. There was a great article in the Huffington Post this week saying this is really splitting the Reform Coalition in California, splitting Democrats. What's your take on that? Do you think is that fair game to go after those agency fees?
Look, it's not exactly like that. I mean, this is dealing with it's a campaign finance issue essentially. That saying that money cannot be deducted from teacher paychecks or from government contractors' paychecks and used for political purposes. It's not the same as collecting dues or agency fees just to keep the unions running. So I don't consider it necessarily an education reform issue. I think it is a campaign finance issue. And I can tell you that we have folks with our organization all over the country who are all over the map on this issue. There is division on this issue. I think in California, the amount of money that the California Teachers Association throws around is so astronomical that it makes it hard to comprehend outside of California. But it's a dicey issue, I can assure you that.
So why not say that, hey, this isn't fair, they have such a huge influence in this debate, we should disallow them to raise campaign funds from people who are saying, look, I don't agree with you, I'm not a part of your member, I may be of a different party, I haven't said it's okay for you to use my money in this way?
I mean, there was an earlier version of this Prop 32, which required teachers to give their consent for it to be used. That's not in the final version of it. I think I think it's an interesting discussion about whether teachers are giving permission for money to be used a certain way. I think that I've always viewed the campaign finance type issues as one of being transparency. If everybody knows the California Teachers Association is going to be the biggest spender, you kind of sort of let what they're spending it on kind of roll off your back because you just know it's just money. It's a lot of political consultants getting a lot of getting rich off the teacher union. But I think this is at the end of the day a very different question than the right of unions to exist or to even collect dues to be able to keep their operations running. And that's the Wisconsin stuff was very different than what's playing out in California right now.
Terry, what's your take on this, say, campaign finance issue? Would that help in California if non-members no longer had to pay those campaign finance dollars?
Sure. Yeah, I think that it would be a good thing to restrict their ability to use dues that are deducted from paychecks for political purposes. I really think that if members want to contribute to politics, they should do that, and they should contribute to union PACs. They should do it voluntarily and individually. Mm-hmm. And I also don't think that the government should be in the business of deducting dues from paychecks, period. I think it should be the union's responsibility to collect dues from their members.
Let's go back, Terry, to what we were talking with Joe about a little bit in terms of Rahm getting rolled. Seemed like he had the perfect conditions in Chicago, and yet he lost on some key issues, even with mayoral control. So, I mean, what's your takeaway on that? Is that exactly what you'd predict?
No. Why would you expect him to win? You know, I mean, their power is real. You know, for any elected official, having a strike is a disaster. Everybody hates you. Right? Politicians don't want strikes. Unions know that. Right? And even though strikes are rare, they're in the background. And politicians are always thinking, oh my God, they could go out on strike. So unions have real power. They have power in many ways. I mean, you know, one of the ways they exercise power locally is that they participate in school board elections. And many of the people on the school board are there because they got elected by the teachers' unions. And they're the teachers' unions' allies and friends. And so then, you know, since they're the ultimate authorities in school districts, the unions are essentially bargaining with their friends. And this is a very, very bad situation, and it gives the unions enormous power locally.
Though in Chicago, as in other big cities now, it's no longer, there's no school boards, right?
Yeah,
and you've got mayors who in many cases ran without the support of the unions, just like our current president ran without the support of the unions in the primary. Again, does that help?
Yes, and that's why I think a number of cities have moved toward mayoral control, because mayors have big, diverse constituencies, right, compared to school board members. They have many more resources of their own. They're under a public spotlight. They want to achieve great things in office, and the teachers' unions will find it more difficult to influence mayors than they do school board members, right? So as a result, mayors can be a real problem for the teachers' unions. That was the case in New York City. It was the case in Washington, D.C., which is where Michelle Rhee came from. And it's proved difficult for them in a number of other cities around the country. So I think school boards are basically pathetic institutions. I mean, they do a very bad job of running the schools, and a big part of the reason is they're democratically elected. And the unions play big roles in these elections, and those people on the local school board are not really representing the public as strongly as they should be.
And some more lines to tweet there. By the way, NSBA, National School Boards Association, @ NSBA. They'll love that tweet. Pathetic. Good.
Can I just two follow-ups on that? I think I would concede that my sort of more laissez-faire, like let's collectively bargain all the bad stuff out, that whole theory does get weakened considerably when you look at the school board composition and the political power that unions exert in school board races. I'll concede that. I don't think that takes the public off the hook, though, from holding their elected representatives, whether they're mayors or school board members, accountable for bargaining contracts or signing contracts that are going to be good for public education, good for kids, good for taxpayers, all that kind of stuff. I worry that sometimes when we look for the silver bullet, we're taking the pressure off the people that we need to be putting more pressure on to get this stuff done. On the Chicago thing, and strikes in general, while it can be extremely powerful for teacher unions, it's not assured. It could be a pretty risky thing for them. And I have to think that the Chicago union didn't make the decision to go out on strike until they knew for sure that they were in a good position. And I think they worked on this for a long time. There were people in Chicago that believed the idea that this was a strike about whether there were going to be air conditioners in classrooms. I mean, the messaging that the union was out there with was extremely powerful, extremely compelling, and it ultimately worked. I don't think the conditions were ever that good for Mayor Emanuel to get that deal done. I think he was perceived as the bad guy from day one in this entire storyline in Chicago.
All right, we're going to get the audience in here, both here in the live audience and online. If you're online, you can send us a question at questions@edexcellence.net, or you can tweet us. Again, the hashtag is AfterCHI, as in After Chicago. While we're getting some of those questions formulated, let me ask you one more question here. You know, in Illinois, reformers a couple years ago made a big deal about how they'd won this big victory with Senate Bill 7, which both raised the threshold for a strike, so they had to get 75% of their members to agree. Also limited what strikes could be done over, right? The teachers couldn't strike over anything but wages and benefits. And yet we had a strike that was over air conditioners, right? And other issues like that. I mean, does this just mean that even if states do move to limit collective bargaining, at the end of the day, the unions are going to do what they're going to do? And I mean, how, are these kinds of laws even enforceable?
I think union power is directly related to collective bargaining, because when you have collective bargaining, you're guaranteed of having all or virtually all teachers in the district belong to the union and pay dues to the union. If there is no collective bargaining, that's not true. And so unions tend to have much lower membership levels in states and districts that don't have collective bargaining.
All right, but let's take Wisconsin. There still is collective bargaining in Wisconsin over wages and benefits, right? Or maybe just wages?
Just wages. I think.
Just wages,
But
okay.
most of the districts in the state bargain their contracts knowing that this law was coming anyway, so they're going to expire in a couple of years.
All right, so there is bargaining over wages. So let's say when the Milwaukee contract comes up, what's keeping the Milwaukee teachers from bargaining over other stuff anyway? And saying that if you don't give us what we want on this other stuff, we'll still strike and we'll still give you a hard time. I mean, are these state laws enforceable?
You know, that's a really important point, because you look at the states, you know, like Texas, you know, where collective bargaining is prohibited. All right. So it turns out 65% of the teachers in Texas belong to unions. And if you look at the cities that are big, Dallas, you know, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, right? They have big, powerful unions, and what the unions do there is they just act like regular interest groups. So yeah, there's no collective bargaining, so what they do is they just participate in school board elections, right? Then they go to the school board and lobby them, just as would happen at the state level, right? On any kind of an issue. They go to the school board and they say, okay, this is what we want. These are the wages we want, these are the benefits we want, these are the work rules we want, and then it's just sheer power politics. The difference is there is no binding legal contract, right? So they're on shakier ground there, but the district is still under pressure to write policies that embody the same sorts of rules.
And those teacher unions go to the state as well.
Absolutely.
Right.
But
So in Texas, they get a lot of things into state law that
Yes.
other unions might get into contracts.
But the tension that exists if the state sort of rams something through and the unions aren't on board with it at the local level, there's so many different ways to sabotage it. The stories this week about Michigan, where merit pay was sort of put into play by the state legislature. The way it was collectively bargained between labor and management in a couple districts, they gave their best teachers $1 as merit pay. They followed the law. I mean, it's at the end of the day, the local collective bargaining agreement it rules the day.
Okay, let's get into some questions. Let's start in the audience. We got some hands going up. Okay, right over here. Tell us your name, where you're from, and our usual Washington rules here. You got to ask a question, not make a speech with a question mark. Good.
Okay, my name is Camille Anderson. I'm on the State Board of Education in Washington, D.C., so I guess that makes me rather pathetic. But I wanted to ask you a question, Dr. Moe. And note that of the 15 states that have below average high school and college graduation rates, at least 11 of them are right-to-work states where teachers have no binding agreements in the way that you're speaking about. So why is it that these states where the unions don't obviously have the power among the lowest performing in the nation?
You know, if you went back before there were unions anywhere, before there was collective bargaining anywhere, the states in the South didn't do as well educationally. You know, they have a long history of poor educational performance. They have much higher minority populations. They are much poorer than the rest of the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are many factors that account for student achievement. And so just saying they don't have unions says nothing about the role of unions, the impact of unions on student achievement.
Okay, next question. Let's go over here. Thank you, Pamela. Yes.
Hi, my name is Dan Brown. I'm a National Board Certified teacher at a charter school here in D.C. And I feel like I would like you to say a little more, Professor, on this point. If there's all these other factors contributing to right-to-work states having poor performance, why are you hanging your hat on unions being this albatross that's dragging them down? And on a global scale, how do you account for all the top-achieving OECD countries, you know, Canada, Korea, Finland, Singapore, Japan, all the ones at the very top all have very strong unions. why is union power so poisonous if it's not getting in the way whatsoever of these countries that are now outperforming us? And here at home, most of the top states on the NAEP scores are all unionized.
Yeah, well, I just answered that part of it. It's exactly the same thing, exactly the same answer.
So other
But
factors.
look, the first part of your question was, say it again. The
But
first part-
why are you so focused on unions
yeah,
if they don't
yeah.
relate
Okay,
to
look,
student achievement?
look.
Right. If
Look,
these trends have lasted
okay.
for 100 years, why is it the union that you're singling out as the poison pill?
The unions have a huge effect on the organization of schools through collective bargaining. And as a result, the schools are burdened with organizations that are not suited to effective performance. That is a huge thing. In the political process, for the last 30 years, they've been playing an active, powerful role in standing in the way of major reforms. And they have made the entire reform era a disappointment. They are the main leaders of the opposition against reform. That's why I don't think they're the only factor that affects student achievement.
The
In
top
fact,
states and the top countries are all heavily unionized.
so
and that's
but what does that mean to you? I mean,
they're not
why-
getting in the way of great achievement.
Well, let me put in
but
a.
I think let's deal with this, because I think it's an argument that just doesn't stand up. Look at Finland. How many people do they have in Finland? About 5 million, right? Finland has a completely different political system. They have a parliamentary system. We have a separation of power system. They have a completely different labor relations system than we do, where contracts are bargained way up here, and there are no fat contracts filled with work rules that are imposed on the schools. In fact, the schools have a great deal of autonomy. Everything is different when it comes to collective bargaining and how it operates. They have a very different culture there. They have very few poor people in Finland. Everything is different. So if you say, oh, well, they have unions, that doesn't say anything about the role that unions play there. And number one. And number two, it doesn't say anything about whether that role could be transplanted to the United States. And that same thing follows for every single country that you can point to.
Okay. And by the way, I was going to say this for later, but I'll put in a little commercial for a big Fordham study coming out in 2 weeks on the strength of the teacher unions in the 50 states. What we're trying to do is to look at a comprehensive way, something like 38 different indicators to measure that union strength, more than just the percentage of teachers who are unionized. And I think you'll find some surprises when you look at that ranking, when you look at a more nuanced look at what teacher power looks like. Okay, next question.
Got Leo in the corner over there.
Oh, we have one in the corner?
Leo Casey.
Thank you, around the corner. Good,
He was going to attack us if we didn't call.
good.
I'm Leo Casey from the Schenker Institute. And I note that on a panel on the future of teacher unions, Fordham couldn't quite bring itself to include a voice of teacher unions.
We did invite Lily, the vice president of the NEA, and she turned us down.
Let me say that if there had been, and certainly if you had come to the AFG, we certainly would have supplied you with someone. If there had been a person on this panel, then maybe the ideological fable that Terry Moe has weaved might have some critique of it. I'll give you just one example. And this is something I wrote about in the American Political Science Association with regard to his book. The fabulously wealthy, UFT and NEA, he says, they have so much wealth that over the last 20 years they've spent $60 million on federal elections. According to Stephen Brill, in 5 days, Michelle Rhee raised $40 million more than what the AFT and NEA spent over 20 years. What we have in this country today is a movement of power and wealth, of the Walmarts, the Rupert Murdochs. It is a movement to destroy what is left of an American trade union movement and the progressive forces that has had. It's a movement in Wisconsin and in other places which is linked with voter suppression. It is a political movement.
Okay. So so the question is, has the dynamic changed now that we've got these well-funded reform groups coming in? Is that
The question is, maybe next time will Fordham see fit to include a teacher union voice in a panel on teacher unions?
Now that you're in town now, right, Leo? Yep. We'll have you on one of these events. I look forward to that. Okay, but again, we did invite the NEA. They turned us down. But Terry, what do you think about this? Are we in a new era now that you do have groups like Joe's, Michelle Ree's, Stand for Children, out there raising lots of money, both on sort of nonprofit side that big foundations can give to, also on political fundraising. So, is it no longer true that the unions have this sort of a hegemonic power when it comes to campaign finance?
Well, I think over the last few years they've been caught in a perfect storm, and I think the storm will pass. What happened in 2010 with the Republican victories was very unusual. That will pass. The fiscal crisis will pass. The pension crisis, well, they'll do something about it. So the years ahead, in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, will be better, for the teachers' unions. Look, the Democrats, they are out challenging the unions in the trenches, but they are doing nothing to undermine the power of the unions, because they know the power of the unions is important to the power of the Democratic Party, and they want powerful unions. So I think, actually the unions, were it not for technology, are in pretty darn good shape.
Joe, let me give you a chance to respond. This is sort of, you've got all these billionaire boys club against Norma Ray.
Right.
Is that fair? You're just collecting money from these hedge fund guys, and you're going after these powerless teachers? What's your take on that?
I'll say in 2010 in New York State, we spent more than the teacher unions, the city and state, on lobbying in the state. That was the first time that ever happened. I don't think it'll probably ever happen again. And going back 25 years, this was 1 year in a blip. There is money going into advocacy around education reform. I think those of us who are doing it would love to see the amounts sort of match what people perceive are out there. I think
that's a fundraising plea, Joe?
Well, it's actually more of a dynamic that the sort of conspiracies about how much money is flying around actually, in all honesty, make us seem like we're more connected to money than we actually are. Every time Diane Ravitch tweets about financial aspects of what things that I'm working on, it always ends up making me more relevant than I was before she did. It's sort of because it takes a while for the official filings that you file to show how much you spent, and when people are claiming you're spending more than you are, you're sort of given more credit than you actually have earned at the time. But it's look, I think. On the education reform movement, I think that a lot of people that have been funding education issues for a long time realized they had hit a wall that they couldn't get over unless the political climate changed.
Is this leading to something of an arms race, Joe? I mean, do we see the unions going back to their members to raise more money so that they can match what you and Michelle and Joel and others are coming up with?
Well, I mean, this sort of gets back to my original point about the overreach in Wisconsin and the aftermath. And as I said in the setup, organized labor itself and teachers' unions were not as close 2 years ago as they are today, because the unions are able to go and say there is a very clear threat on the horizon from people who want to end our very existence and our right to represent you as teachers. I think that's been a very much a motivating factor. I think there's, the president of the Wisconsin State Union said, this made us, this is the shot we needed to sort of get back in the game. They were flat for a while. They were playing defense for a while, and this got them playing offense again.
Okay, next question. Here in the front. Don't forget, if you're watching at home or on the office, questions at edexcellence.net. Yes, sir.
Yes, I am Marco Fernandez from Duke University. And my question is, if you were hired as an advisor for the education department, what would be your advice on how to proceed for education reform, given your diagnostic of the power, both in political terms and in economic terms, of the union? Are there feasible alternatives to move forward on education reform, given what you observe as a veto capacity of teachers' unions in many states in the U.S. to move on education reform?
Well, this is obviously a sticky wicket. You know, I mean, if you're in the education department and you're advising the Secretary of Education or maybe the President on what to do, you know, on the one hand, there's the question of what can we do that would be the best thing for children. But on the other hand, politicians don't think that way. You know, I hate to say that, but politicians, I think, care about kids and want to do something. And I think Obama and Duncan, you know, they took a risk, a political risk, doing what they were doing. And they did it because they believed it. They believed it was the right thing to do. Good for them. I'm proud of them for doing what they did. But they didn't go as far as they could have gone. You know, and this whole business about union buy-in and the whole deal, isn't it? And also all the money they spent preventing teacher layoffs. They were trying to sort of split the difference. It's like, okay, we're going to do these things that you hate, but in return, we're going to do these things that you like, right? And so they're trying to keep their coalition together. I think that this is a political problem, and it's a problem because the unions are really powerful. And if you take out and do things that they don't want you to do, they can retaliate in many different ways. And politicians shy away from that. That is the key to their success over the last 30 years, and there aren't any good answers to it.
Terry, here's a question from somebody via email. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. There's a sense out there that when unions get attacked, many individual teachers end up feeling attacked and demoralized. And the question is there a way to limit union power while still valuing the professional expertise of teachers? How do we keep this sort of stuff from being so demoralizing and divisive and really make it clear to teachers that, you know, we value their work even if we don't want their unions to be as strong as they are? Is there a way to thread that needle?
Well, in fact, it's not an attack on teachers personally.
But they feel it.
Yes, they do. I'm going with this.
I want you to feel their pain, too.
Yeah, really. I think this is just a factually based, practical recognition that union power leads to organizations of American schooling that are not built for effectiveness. They just are not, right? And if we ever want to do something about that, if we ever want to build a system that really works, we can't do it if there's this massive power that is resisting it and also imposing structures that undermine effective organizations. So, I think teachers naturally think, man, you're attacking us, right? And in part, they are being attacked, and in part, they're not. So let me try to explain that quickly. They are being attacked because, look, teachers join unions because they want their jobs protected. That's why unions do what they do, because that's why teachers are in unions. Teachers want their unions to do these things. Teachers like their unions. They're very supportive of their unions, right? So really, when you attack the unions and say we should undermine union power, you're attacking teachers in that sense. On the other hand, teachers are more than just constellations of job interests, right? The unions represent those interests, but they don't represent all the other things that teachers are as human beings, right? And if they love kids, they put a lot of effort into their courses, maybe they're fantastic in the classroom, all those things are really valued. It's the power part and the focus on job protection that's the problem.
All right, Joe, let's try this with you. I can imagine that you're at a sporting event or a playground, you meet somebody, they're a teacher. You have that feeling like, oh my God, they're going to find out what I do for a living.
Yep.
And they say, oh, you're one of those terrible hedge fund guys that's trying to break the teachers' unions. Well, how do you explain to a teacher here in the audience about why you're trying to challenge teacher unions, but you still love what they do?
I mean, this is my Little League baseball experience in Greenwich Village Little League in New York City. I think you can't get hung up on this issue. I mean, you got to, if you're talking about a better public school system, and at the end of the day, you've got to have enough confidence in what you're proposing will help get you there. That you got to just keep your head down. Not only
so it just doesn't matter? We just have a bunch of demoralized teachers and that's okay?
I think I mean, if you're talking about a better education system, you're talking about a better education system for teachers, students, taxpayers, parents, everybody. And I think that keeping it at that level to the extent that you can makes the conversations a lot more easier to digest. What makes it particularly complicated, though, is that it is a very easy tool for anybody in this debate to accuse somebody that they disagree with of just bashing teachers. It's sort of become a very easy thing to throw at. So I mean, it's a problematic issue, but I think that it is important for people that are pushing or proposing change or asking for change to try to explain how it is that that change is going to be good for everybody. I don't think anybody that I know that is working on this stuff wants to see a system that is bad for teachers at the end of the day.
Okay, here I got one from Twitter. This is a softball question for you, Terry. It's from the Texas Parents Union. What about school choice? Is that a way to limit union power without taking them on as directly?
Yes.
See 1990 politics markets in America's schools.
Well, I mean, 4.5% of the kids are in charter schools. That's very little progress in 20 years. But suppose 40% of the kids were in charter schools.
Like here in D.C.
Or in New Orleans, 70%, right? And so charter schools are almost all non-union. And therefore, the membership in the local union goes way down. And their dues go way down. And their power is going to go way down. So I think the expansion of choice, which would be a very popular thing if it could just happen in the political process, would be a surefire way of undermining the power of the union.
This is an interesting example of the charter school example. If unionized charter schools and management at unionized, non-unionized charter schools, management at non-unionized charter schools can figure out a way to create a school environment where the teachers are happy and the parents are happy and the kids are happy, and they can hold off organizing attempts, there's going to be some interesting models because there's nothing that's preventing the charter schools that everybody thinks they may start out non-unionized. There's nothing preventing them from getting organized if they're horrible places to work, and it's happening all around the country.
Well, not many of them are unionized, and I think the reason that they have the freedom to unionize, and they just haven't.
I think that does depend a little bit on the state. I think there's some states that would not allow unions within charter schools.
But I think it's really important to look at the schools that are able to, charter schools that are able to last a long time. And this is still a very young movement about what it is that they're doing at those schools to make their teachers, not entertain the idea of unionizing.
Yes.
Okay, let's get a question here in the front row.
Hi, my name is Silas Kulkarni. I started off in ed policy here in DC, and the last 4 years I've been a teacher in high-performing charters. Never was a member of a union, never really had an interest in being a member of a union. But I really have to say I didn't feel like you guys meaningfully answered the question about the biggest thing I learned when I went from policy to practice was teaching is this thankless profession, and you give your blood, sweat, and tears, and then people say, you're a jerk and you're the problem. So tell me a little bit more concretely, not just general interest, it's good for everybody to have good schools. How do you get teachers to buy into what seems like you're promoting as anti-unionism?
Well, in my view, this is all about the power of the union and what unions do with their power. Right? It's not an attack on teachers. However, I don't know that we can avoid having many teachers feel that way, right? That they're under attack. And I don't expect there to be a groundswell of teacher support for doing away with collective bargaining. Right? It will, if it happens, it will come over teacher opposition because teachers like collective bargaining.
Let me put off my moderator hat just for a moment here. I think that we've got to talk about this in terms of values, right? And so one value is professional autonomy. We know that high-performing schools, systems around the world, that teachers have a lot of professional autonomy. And I think so making the case with some specific examples of how we want teachers to be able to use judgment, to have more freedom, to be real professionals in the classroom, and how we know that district bureaucracies get in the way, but so do those, big, stacky union contracts. And so this is part of an effort to try to provide more professional autonomy. That's a big argument for charter schools, not just a free market argument, but it's the argument that allows a group of professionals to get together and to run an organization in a sane way. So I think some of that language might help. I think we also have to get specific and talk about specific things that might be getting in the way. I'm convinced by polling data and other things that teachers respond well to the idea of finding ways to remove their ineffective peers from the classroom, and that ineffective teachers can be incredibly demoralizing for other teachers. And so I think there's a way to talk about that, making sure it's done in a fair way, that there's protections, it's not capricious. But what we're trying to do is create a good professional environment for people. Does that start to get closer?
Starting to get there. I mean, to be honest, I most want to hear from Joe because,
Yeah, fair enough. Joe, they want to hear from you.
They win too, right?
Yeah, look, I don't mean to suggest that there's no value in thinking about how you present these kind of issues. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the best reform legislation that my group's been involved with in the last couple of years has been led by teachers, and it's teachers in the legislature, teacher leaders, and I think that takes some of the sting off of some of those attacks. The teacher evaluation, teacher tenure bill in Colorado, the state senator Mike Johnston, who led that, is a former teacher. Even he was not immune from the attacks on this stuff. Part of the whispering campaign against him and the bill in the final days was rumors about what his evaluation would have looked like when he was a teacher based on the scores that existed in his kids' classes. So. Again, it's a weapon that's easily used against you. Probably is an argument for why we should even be more careful about it. But I don't think you can let that hang you up if you're working with teachers on a lot of these issues, then it adds to your ability, that your comfort that you're pointed in a direction that is ultimately going to be good for the teaching force.
Terry, back to you with a question via email. It says, why single out teachers' unions? Their mission is to be advocates. Shouldn't we be limiting all interest groups, including corporate interests? Okay, people say, hey, you got the Koch brothers out there spending money in Wisconsin and the California initiative. This is calling for some kind of unilateral disarmament.
Are you talking about Prop 32, or are you just talking about why focus on the teachers'
I would say
power?
Let's talk about, your general argument that we need to limit teacher union power. Why aren't we trying to limit the power of all special interest groups?
Because if you look at the politics of education over the last 30 years, they are by far the most powerful groups in the reform process. They've been blocking reform. They're the ones that we should focus on, right? They're the 800-pound gorillas.
So
and
let me play.
Also, I should just say that in any institutional system, pick them, healthcare, agriculture, they all have vested interests that benefit from the system as it is, and that will repel attempts to change the system. And in education, teachers' unions are vested interests because their members have jobs that are embedded in the system, and those vested interests are threatened. And that's another reason why it makes perfect sense that they would be the ones leading the opposition, and they are.
Yeah, so just play devil's advocate here. Let's say you got interested in gun policy. Would you feel the same way? We got to find a way to limit the power of the NRA because it's warping our politics on that issue?
Well, I think the NRA is the most powerful force in the politics of gun control, right? So I guess it depends on what side of the issue you're on. My own belief, this is really off to the side here, is I believe in very strict gun control. I don't think people should be allowed to own handguns, and I wouldn't be very popular in the halls of the NRA. So, if I were a politician and really working on gun control, I would be in favor of doing things that would undermine their power, if I could do that.
So, really, in some ways, you're making a pragmatic argument here that says,
yes.
Just the evidence is clear that the unions are the most powerful actor,
it's
that
totally
they are
pragmatic.
blocking positive things from happening.
And I think there are a lot of people who will just say, well, you're just an ideologue. You're just some sort of a right-wing nut, when really this is a very practical argument that's rooted in a recognition that their power has real consequences for effective organization in schools, and therefore real consequences for kids. And if we don't do something about it, this is not good for children.
Okay, let's get one more question right here in the back. Been waiting.
Hi, this question would have been for the union person on the panel. Can we just flip the power argument? What would unions need to do to recalibrate that power so that they support the organizational schools that are in line with the best interests of students, the kinds of things that you've talked about? We've touched on a few of them, but can you just break it down?
Well, okay, what I would say is that there's a fundamental problem at the core of what you're saying. It's like saying, what can we do so that businesses will stop trying to make money? Yeah, something's wrong with that question, right? Because they're not going to do that. That's what businesses are. They're trying to make money. And that's what explains their behavior. Well, unions are in the business of protecting jobs. That's why people join unions. And so you can say, well, let's just get them to stop behaving as though they're protecting jobs. They are protecting jobs, and they're going to continue doing those things. So I think that there is no solution to this. As long as they're powerful, they will continue to behave in these ways.
But
Don't
Terry,
expect a cat to bark.
But Terry, don't you know? It's true about businesses, and yet there have been a variety of campaigns to try to make businesses be more socially responsible.
And they
So-
never work.
So that's interesting. So you think, for example, companies that say we are going to be environmentally sensitive.
Look, I think it's great if they have some influence, but there's a reason why we have an environmental protection agency, and we have a Consumer Product Safety Commission and all these laws about deceptive practices and all the rest. And the reason is businesses do those things. And the reason they do those things is they want to make money. And so we have to do something to constrain their behavior and to penalize bad behavior, because they will behave badly. And the reason is they want to make money, and we can't change that.
Joe, any last statements?
Just, I think we, sort of to answer your question, I think we have the opportunity to really confront the fiscal realities that are still out there, and to engage in a bigger discussion about what are all of us going to have to do to convince the public that this thing is worth saving, that being public education. I think that, if we can answer that question, we know how far we're going to have to go to make a compelling case that we're giving every child who comes into public education an opportunity to hit the ball out of the park, and to provide the kind of schools where teachers feel like they are being treated with the kind of professionalism and respect that they deserve in there. Or just I go back, I'll beat this again. The Wisconsin situation made it so much harder to have that conversation than it's ever been.
We'll let Joe have the last word. Please join me in thanking Joe and Terry for a great discussion. Let me say it again. In less than 2 weeks, big Fordham study coming out on the power of teacher unions state by state. Look forward to that. And finally, the video of this event will be up momentarily. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay tuned for our next event, which will be in the middle of November. Put a plug in on my book, The Diverse Schools Dilemma. So look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much.
You got to read that.